I'm joined by the wonderful clarinetist slash composer slash improviser slash, fill in the blank here. That is Kinan Azmeh, who Toledo audiences may remember from last year. I think it was last November that you came here and played with the Toledo Symphony.
Absolutely correct. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, yeah, that was a delight for us. Also, I did an interview with Johnny Gandelsman, and he talked about a piece of yours, Sarah B. Wyckoff, right?
Right,
That was
right,
on
right,
his
right.
anthology. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I feel like I have a little bit of a connection to you, that I know you a little bit, but I've been listening to this new album, a fairly recent album called Flow,
Mhm.
which is all of your music, and it's very much in the jazz mold, which is different from what I've sort of associated with you in the past. I wonder if you could just start by telling us about your worldview as a composer and a performer. What kind of music do you like to create and listen to, and what is that all about for you?
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Um, you name it. Like you fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Every time I want it, I want to describe what I do. I always describe it in a way. I write what I like to hear, and I play what I like, really. And I happen to have a large appetite for a variety of things. I grew up in Damascus. I learned Western classical music, even though I don't agree with the term, because I don't think that music is only Western. I related to it from an early age, and so it became my vocabulary too. But growing up in a city like Damascus, where there are lots of other sorts of music that are played on the radio at any given moment, mainly Arabic music, but we heard lots of Kurdish and Armenian music, and I had early interest in jazz, and I wanted to do it all. So now what I do for a living is I write my own music, and my music, I think, has lots of different sensibilities. Again, it's I always like to walk on that fine line between the improvised and the composed, and
Yeah.
that happens when I'm playing music, whether music that I've written myself or music written by other people for me. And also when I write, when I play music by from the repertoire, when I write, like when I play the Mozart concerto, for example, I always like to think that this piece will have to sound somehow improvised,
Mm,
because it's written in a way you can almost think that Mozart just like improvised the whole thing on the piano,
yeah.
and maybe he did, I don't know, but so so every album of mine, maybe sometimes I try to showcase a different thing that I like to do.
Yeah.
The prior album called An Even Sky, which had the concerto that Karim Rustum wrote for me, which you heard with the Toledo Symphony. That was an album of mixed, like basically a symphony orchestra and myself. This recent album, Flow, is with another type of band, if you want. It's the indie Arabic band, and all the music is mine on that album, beautifully arranged by a wonderful German composer and arranger, Wolf Kerschik, and who conducted the recording session also. Um, I mean, am I a jazz player? I don't know. Am I a classical player? I don't know. I think I like to play again. Back to the first sentence I said. I like to play the music I like, and I like to compose what I like to hear.
It's so interesting that you mention, well, I mean, everything that you mentioned, but talking about Mozart and improvisation in the same sentence, you think of some of those piano concertos that he left part of the piano part blank, just assuming that he could fill it in, he knew what it was, but a lot of that was happening in real time, I think. When you listen to the different works that you have on Flow, a lot of that seems very improvisatory as well. I mean, it's jazz, there must be some improv involved. How does that work? I mean, do you just tell your collaborators, this for this part, here's a roadmap, but I want you to do your own thing? I mean, how are you as a jazz composer working with other instrumentalists?
I love this sentence. If you really kind of analyze it, like, do your thing. I
Mm,
mean, all of us as artists would like to just do that. So So when I'm collaborating with people, with an orchestra like the NDR Big Band, which is formed of some incredible composers and improvisers,
Yeah.
whatever you write, of course there are the tutti parts that where everything has to play, of course, what's there. But of course, it will be a shame if you don't allow the artist to really do what they do best.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's great.
I always describe what the piece is about, and that sometimes doesn't come across in the score. I give them the emotional context sometimes, and of course, there's a point A where the improvised solo part begins, and you have to get us to point B. So I always tell people how it starts and how it should end, and whatever in between, it's up to them to compose on the fly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I like. Also, I like this duality. Of I like pieces that where you don't know is this improvised or is this composed. I like that aspect, and I like also improvised solos that somehow sound structured as if they are composed.
Yeah.
So that's what I share. This information is what I share with my colleagues.
It's really interesting. I was listening to your clarinet concerto on this Flow album because I've heard you play a completely different clarinet concerto when you came to Toledo and you did
Right.
Rusrum's piece.
That's right.
And I spoke with him about that as well. But your clarinet concerto is very kind of soft. And at first I thought it was just going to be all solo clarinet, but the band kind of creeps in, and then all heck breaks loose.
Right.
you know, I wonder if we can talk about some of the works on this album, and I do want to start with one of your quotes on here. You say that being in a constant state of flow is now my new zone of comfort. I mean, can you talk about what that means?
Absolutely. I think it has to do with places. I mean, this recording session, so people have like some kind of historic context. The project started before the pandemic. We recorded during the pandemic. There was a little opening in Germany where I was able to go, with all the precautions, everything. We managed to record. The last day of the recording session, Germany shut down. Everything was shut down. So it was the last, sailing ship, if you want, for me, before everything took, like stood still. So basically, some of these pieces I've been working on for a long time. Some pieces were not meant for the NDR big band, like the concerto that you mentioned. And what you heard actually is not the full piece. The piece was written for the Seattle Symphony back in 2018,
Oh,
and it has a slow section and then a middle section, that is a little bit improvised, and then where everything goes and everybody's like really overplaying. And I decided that maybe the second section would work for the NDR big band. So it wasn't like a decision of mine to cut it short. I just thought like this will lend itself easily. And I like how lots of my works actually spill over. Like you mentioned Johnny earlier, I wrote a piece for the quartet for Brooklyn Rider, quartet called Dabke on Martin Street, and that piece also was initially it was written as a lead sheet for my jazz quartet, and then I thought, you know what, like there's more potential to this just than a lead sheet. Let me make it a big piece. So this idea of flow actually exists in the music I make, but also I think it exists in my relation to spaces. And I've been, between Damascus and New York, and I travel a lot to Europe. And my wife is Lebanese, so we go to Lebanon often. And I always enjoyed being the other. Like when I'm in Damascus, I'm the New Yorker. When I'm in New York, I'm the Damascene. The pandemic, sorry, this is a very long answer to your question, but I think I'm
it's
getting to something.
interesting. Yeah.
And when the pandemic hit, and we just moved to our current apartment in Brooklyn, and we have a little backyard. And it was for the first time, and I've been living in New York for the last 21 years. And it was the first time that I saw the sequence of seasons. It's the first time that I noticed the spring actually is coming, because we have a backyard, but also because I'm staying in the same place for a longer period. And it moved me a lot actually when we planted the first tree in this backyard, because it was the first time that I noticed the soil and the soul of the city, really, you know? And it was the first time that I got to really know the neighbors around. It's the first time that I have a longer conversation with the bodega on the corner. So suddenly I'm like, you know what? I've been missing all of this,
Mm.
willingly or unwillingly, I don't know. But suddenly you know what? I want to be in the New Yorker in New York. I don't want to talk always about the place I left behind. And when I go to Damascus, I want to talk to the Damascene, not telling them about what's happening in New York. I want to be involved with what's happening in Damascus. So I think changing identities became less of an issue for me. I want to be the local anywhere I go. I don't want to be no longer the imported musician, you know?
Yeah.
I want to be as local as possible.
It's
Sorry, again,
interesting.
long answer to your question.
No, that's great. It's so interesting, and it calls to mind a few different questions, you know, that when you describe this experience. What is the difference generally between like a Syrian person, somebody from Damascus, such as yourself, and your typical New Yorker? Because you're putting a lot of ideas in my head, and I'm wondering what are the different aesthetics between the two cultures?
You know, I don't think there's. I mean, if you ask, I don't know how many million like New Yorkers, if you ask them what is the typical New Yorker, I don't think people will get to an agreement. Maybe one will be like New Yorkers who actually complain about the city. That's what makes you a New Yorker. If you complain about the city the whole time while continue to love it. And I think maybe also that's what unites Damascenes also together, you know? Like this constant love-hate relationship with a place, I think is important. Aesthetically speaking, you know, it's hard to know today with the fact that the world is open, and you can, you know, if you have a curious mind, you can check out any music from anywhere in the world on your, you know, on your devices. You know, it's hard for me to. I don't think there is actually anything that separates the culture, really.
Yeah.
I think cultures do speak sometimes specific vocabularies, which I understand, but I think any culture or any individual from any culture has the ability to become fully immersed in another culture if they spend the time digging vertically in it. I think we do that naturally with food, for example. You know, if you like, you know, we love different foods, and we try. The moment you want to make that food, that requires not only loving the culture, it requires you spending time learning it. I spent my life learning how to play Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. So I do feel like that culture belongs to me. I'm not a foreigner to that culture, and that culture is not foreigner to me. And I think the same way. I think the same way about arts. The same way about when I think about people. People do form a continuum. The same way music and different genres of music form a continuum.
Yeah.
It depends on the individual, on how much effort you're willing to put, and how many hours you're willing to spend enjoying the culture. I'd like to stress out the word enjoyment, because it's not a duty. It's, you know, it's a culture you like. Spend more time studying in it until you become part of that culture.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm curious, what got you into the clarinet in the first place? I mean, what was that story for you?
That's a good story. Again, actually, it has to do with a lot of like cross-cultural debates, if you want. I started on the violin when I was maybe 5 or 6. My dad is an amateur violinist, so he thought, you know, we have a violin at home. Why not the violin? And that didn't go very well. I'm left-handed, so you know, when you start playing the violin, you hold the bow with your right hand, and you just, you know, put the bow on the strings. And that wasn't fun. I remember how miserable I felt doing that. Of course, it was an additional homework too, which I didn't want to. But then we had the Britannica, the full Encyclopedia Britannica at home, and they had this coupon system where you can send letters or questions to the Britannica, way before Google and any internet search. And so my dad wrote to them asking, my son is doing this, he's not having a great time. Suggestions, please. And what's amazing is they responded maybe a month later with like some articles discussing not only my case, but giving some kind of information about the situation. And some of the suggestions they had was either I should switch the strings of the violin so I can play with my left hand, which would be very difficult for me to join an orchestra later on
Yeah.
because my bow would be going opposite to everybody else's. And one of the suggestions they had was to find a teacher who is left-handed, so he or she can relate to my difficulties. And one alternative was to switch to another instrument, because I'm still young. Like, why don't I switch to an instrument that uses the both hands to the same degree of difficulties? And the two instruments that were offered at the Arabic Conservatory of Music at the time in Damascus that did fit that description was either the clarinet or the piano. And as a young child, I always thought, I thought like the word musician and traveler were like the same, you know? And I did think also at the time that pianists had to travel with their own pianos. So I simply went with a lighter instrument. Like,
Really?
okay, clarinet it is. And my cousin, who's like a few years older than I am, and he's the one who taught me how to play soccer also. So I looked up to him and like, yeah, sure, I'll play the clarinet. So it wasn't it's not your classical story where like, oh, I heard the sound and it moved me to tears and I decided to do that. It was none of that. It was a very practical choose the light instrument kind of situation.
Yeah, it's very refreshing, I have to say. And coming from, my first instrument was the clarinet also, so I got about
Right.
this far and then I dropped off. But yeah,
Oh.
yeah, that's wonderful. Let's talk about flow a little more before I let you go. This album we already established as a jazz album you did with the NDR big band and other collaborators or members of that band. And there are 8 different tracks on here, and they all have interesting titles, and it makes me curious as to what was the motivation behind some of these works. If you were to pick a track that you want to share with our listeners that you want to talk about, what would it be?
And that's a great question because one of my favorite tracks on the album. This is again personally. I think I like Clarinet Concerto because I do think it's a different way of writing for big band or what a big band sound is like. I think
Mm.
many of your listeners, and certainly that was also my case. When we say big band, we have a very specific sound in mind and a very specific type of music. And I think Flow tries to, among many other projects that are happening around the globe today, is trying to change that. Like there is another sound that we can bring to the wonderful big band world. And the two tracks that I think of, one of them actually I don't play on it at all. It's called "And We Are All Optimistic," and I do love that track because I love how it sounds actually, and I love the soloists that are featured on that track. The other track that I really like a lot, which doesn't have any kind of autobiographical information, is The Canteen, which is, I think, the second track on the album, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. And most of the other tracks have personal stories to them. The Canteen doesn't. The Canteen was I was simply at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., looking at different artifacts, in the museum. And I saw there's one glass kind of thing where they had two canteens, like water bottles or wine bottles, whatever you want to call them. They were one of them was from Aleppo, from Syria, few thousand years old, and the other one was from current day China, also a few thousand years ago.
Mhm.
And they were identical in size and in like the look. It moved me actually to realize how well the world has been connected for like millennia, right? I mean, whether that's enough to trigger a piece of music or not, I don't know.
Well,
But the
obviously
result
it
was
was
the
for you.
canteen was the result of that. There
Yeah.
are other pieces that are very meaningful to me. There's a piece called Dara, and Dara is the city in the south of Syria, where actually the uprising began in 2011. and the melody is a chant that people used to like sing in the early days of the demonstrations.
Mm,
So the piece, also means a lot to me.
yeah.
And I love how obscure also there's a beautiful trombone solo in the piece that I love. It's funny actually, the two pieces I listed, I'm not soloing on, while concerto and canteen are pieces where I take like an extended solo.
Yeah. But you're the force behind it, even if you're not
I
performing.
guess so. I guess so.
I was hoping you would talk about the last track, Love on 139th Street. Is there a
There
story
is
to
a
that? Or...
story. There's a story to that track. Actually, this track is one of the pieces that have been reoccurring in many of my albums.
Mm,
There's an orchestral version of that in my previous album on in Uneven Sky. There's a version of it on my Hiwar album, which is the band that I founded in Syria. There's a version of it in my City Band album in 2012. The story is the following. I moved to New York in 2001, and I lived in Harlem for the first few years. First 10 years of my New York life was in Harlem. And I had a neighbor who used to blast merengue and reggaeton 24/7 on the first floor, and we lived on the fourth floor. And I remember very clearly, maybe it's 2006, I was trying to write a piece, inspired by Damascus, inspired by Arabic music, you name it. And I will never forget that moment. I'm sitting with a paper and a pen, very old school. And I hear, it's not only I hear, I feel like the shaking of the apartment, from
right.
the first floor. So I'm like, okay, that's going to be the rhythm of the piece, which happens to be also a rhythm that we use a lot in Arabic music. So I always think of this piece as like an homage to the neighbor that I've never met, And every time I play the piece, I always joke, like, I hope this neighbor happens to be sitting right here. If it was you know yourself,
Yeah.
So it's an homage to the neighborhood, to the liveliness of Harlem, and also how that liveliness actually is also similar in other big crazy cities. Whether it's Damascus, Berlin, Delhi, or New York.
It's an interesting concept and totally unexpected. I thought there would be a different kind of story going on there.
Right.
It's obviously a theme that you keep returning to, with the different versions of it and incorporating it into other works. I used to live on 181st Street, so I was up in Washington Heights, a little further north than you were at 139th Street.
I'm familiar with 181st because I lived on 183rd.
Oh, okay.
And San Nicolas for 6 months after my Harlem years. Yeah.
I was there. I moved up from 106th Street in Amsterdam, and then I ended up at 181st Street for a while. But that was probably before you were born. So,
Right.
Well, Kinan Azmeh is a wonderful clarinetist, wonderful composer. If folks want to read all about you and find more information on this album, Flow, they can go to your website, which is your name, right? Yes. Kinan Azmeh. I see it spelled out there under your face, but we'll link to that as well, right, so that people know where to go. Thanks for spending some time today, and I hope you come back to Toledo one of these times.
I hope so too. Thank you very much for having me. Great conversation. To be continued in person, I hope, one day.